I think we are live. Okay. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Green Room, episode 8. My name is Duygusever Mehmetoğlu. Today, I have the pleasure to moderate a very interesting discussion with Professor Randall Abate. Welcome, Professor. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Duygu. It's great to be here.
If you allow me, Professor, let me offer a brief introduction for you, about you to our audience. Of course, a couple of words would not be enough to summarize your expertise on climate and environment issues, but I'll do my best. So Professor Randall Abate is an inaugural Rechnitz Family and Urban Coast Institute Endowed Chair in Marine and Environmental Law and Policy. He is also a professor in the Department of Political Science and Sociology in Monmouth University in New Jersey. He serves also as the director of the Institute for Global Understanding. Professor teaches numerous courses in domestic and international environmental law, climate justice, constitutional law, and animal law. He also has published numerous publications, book chapters, books, journal articles on environmental and animal law topics. Recently, he has been further focusing on climate change and climate justice. And in this regard, he has a very interesting book, which also has given us the inspiration for today's Green Room session. The book is titled Climate Change and Voiceless, Protecting Future Generations, Wildlife and Natural Resources, published by Cambridge University Press. He is also the editor of another recent book titled as What Can Animal Law Learn from Environmental Law? We will have a discussion with Professor Abate, but I would also like to remind you, our dear participants, that we will have a Q&A session at the end of the discussion. So please feel free to write your questions to the chat box or to write your comments. I'll be going over them at the end of the discussion, and we'll ask your questions to Professor. So Professor, let's start with the basics. You are using a very interesting, striking and important term, the voiceless, while talking about climate change and the efforts to mitigate its impacts. What does the term voiceless stand for?
Well, I use this term deliberately in the book to represent those that are not able to represent their own interests under the law. So the three categories that I've identified in the book share that common vulnerability when we talk about future generations of humans, such as youth that are not yet able to vote, and the unborn, and wildlife and natural resources. They share a common vulnerability of not being able to represent their own interests in the legal system, and therefore they need human guardians and advocates to step in to protect their interests, to account for their concerns, because they're not able to participate on their own behalf. And so the term the voiceless does have other meanings outside of this book project, and I certainly respect those references as well. For instance, sometimes voiceless can refer to other marginalized communities of humans who aren't adequately protected under the law. But for purposes of this book project, it's those three categories only.
And of course, we always, when talking about sustainable development or climate change mitigation policies, we always state the importance of having integrated and interdependent policies in different aspects, different issue areas, including different communities and stakeholders. And even the motto of Sustainable Development Goals is leave no one behind. In this regard, all these three categories that you are accumulating under the term of voiceless, what is the importance of including their needs into the efforts of sustainable development? How sustainable development policies can benefit from including the voiceless into the policy making? Or what would be the cost of not including the voiceless, not taking them into account?
Yeah, I think that's very much of a focus of the book's proposal, that it's very easy to overlook the interests of the voiceless and how they are valuable in understanding what we mean by sustainable development. Sustainable development is often taken from a human-focused perspective, and what's important to understand about what sustainability really means is that it really requires us to adopt more of an ecocentric way of looking at moving forward as inhabitants of this planet, and that means that humans are just a part of this broader system of life, and it's not just about the humans. So we very much rely on non-humans to ensure human sustainability. Non-human populations, wildlife, natural resources play valuable roles in ensuring resilience in our fight against climate change, for instance.
Sure. And what do you think is the biggest challenge in this regard for changing this view from the human-centric way so as to include the environment, animal, the future generations, i.e. the voiceless, into the policy-making efforts? What's the biggest challenge to accomplish that?
Well, the first challenge is a word I've used a lot in my recent scholarship, and that's anthropocentrism. The biggest challenge we face is that we think we are the only thing that matters, humans. So the need to overcome anthropocentrism and how we protect the environment and our shared future is perhaps the biggest challenge, and that's one that's taken a long time to move away from, to kind of open people's minds to a more ecocentric way of thinking when it comes to environmental protection. And the other challenge, and that's really a challenge for protecting wildlife and natural resources more effectively because we focus so much on humans. But the other challenge we face is known as short-termism. And this is really a challenge for protecting future generations of humans adequately. I think where this has been a challenge is that much of our consideration in moving forward as humans is driven by cultural values, political expediency, and economics. And so this problem of short-termism ultimately means that we're much better at protecting ourselves, those who are currently alive, and our immediate needs, but we're not as good in thinking about those who will be inheriting the earth after us, current youth and the unborn. And it's harder to make effective laws that take that long view. We tend to be locked into a short-term view of how to protect our planet.
Definitely, and it certainly requires a change of mentality to transform things from short-termness, from human-centered perspective towards a longer-term view and more inclusive view. And I think this change of mentality isn't easy either. So maybe there's a huge role for a change in the education system, or there's a role for the whole education system with regards to changing the mentality of today's and future's policymakers. What would be your reflections on that? What can be the way to impact the mentalities, and what would education play? What kind of a role education would play in this?
Well, I think education is critical, and there's so many different ways education can be involved on these issues. So one is through more formal education, whether we're talking about primary and secondary education. The state in which Monmouth resides, New Jersey, is the first state in the US to require climate change education in the public school curriculum. And it's not just climate science that would be required. It would need to be taught across all subjects. And that's very important, because what we find is that climate change is not perceived the way it needs to be as an intersectional issue. It just affects everything. It's not just this narrow environmental scientific challenge. It's a social problem. It's an economic problem. It's a political problem. And so that's one way in which the new generation, certainly being exposed to this education from their early childhood, will be much better positioned to address climate change than my generation, which didn't have any trace of that. And we were very much locked into that anthropocentric short-term way of thinking and how we approach the world. So the other aspect of education, though, beyond the formal education system, and of course, we're seeing developments at higher education as well, which is very encouraging. So many more programs in the US have emerged just in the past decade on sustainability, master's and doctoral level focus on climate, energy, sustainability, and that's very important. We need current adults to take on the fight every bit as much as the upcoming generation of youth. And then in another way, education is about informing the public. It's about this new field that's emerged called climate change communication. It is about making the public understand on a daily basis what climate change means for their daily lives and for their future, because not everyone is going to get that through any kind of formal education, and yet we all need very effective, easy to understand information about how climate change is impacting our lives.
Definitely, I totally agree with you. And I also think that there is an importance in how you see the notion of security as well. I think especially the policymakers or the conventional system of education, especially with regards to political science or international relations, tend to still see the world through the lenses of traditional understanding of security, which means, of course, the state security, the territorial integrity, and everything in relation with that. And bringing in the human dimension is quite, concept-wise, it's not a new concept, but in terms of practice and perspective-wise, it's, I think, a new dimension to include the human dimension into the notion of security. And policymakers or professors or programs which tend to define the notion of security in a broader terms tend to include more climate change, environment, animal law, and the protection of vulnerable communities with a broader understanding of human security, of course. In line with that, for instance, of course, the policy solutions for this whole transformation is not straightforward, but Professor, if you were to give a recipe for the policymakers and for the society, like separating the two, if you were to give a recipe for a sustainable future and also for mitigating the risks of climate change on the voiceless, what would be your key recommendations?
Yeah, that's hard to summarize in a couple of sentences, but really the approach that the book takes is focused on sustainable development as something that needs to transition from aspirational rhetoric to mandatory requirements. So what we've seen over the past 3 decades with sustainable development is that it's very much something that is considered in decisions, but it is not required to be upheld before development can occur. And the other problem about sustainable development is how we're defining development. We tend to be locked into this notion of development must mean economic progress, and it must mean traditional ways of using land or using resources in a way to go somewhere else with our objectives in society. And basically we need to think more in terms of regenerational values rather than sustainable in that sense, because in many ways with the climate crisis we face, just sustaining what we've done is going to doom us. We have to reverse many of the ways we engage with our world to be able to be truly sustainable. So that means, for instance, when we have such vast concrete jungle developments in our country in the US with shopping malls and movie theaters and too much concrete and not enough green space, what part of what sustainable is going to mean is restoring those spaces to green spaces and to enable us to be adaptive to the threat of climate change more readily, and that is something we're starting to see, and we'll talk more about the effect of the COVID-19 pandemic, but I think that's one step toward that future for us. And the other piece I would say for policymakers is just the importance of understanding the intersectionality of the challenge of climate change, that it can't be perceived as just an environmental problem, that an instrument like the Green New Deal that's been proposed in the US recognizes that intersectionality, that climate change is about racial justice, it's about gender equality, it's about jobs, it's about our food system And of course, it's also a major environmental threat.
Yeah.
So I think that's most important for policymakers, because policymakers have been too much in their silos and thinking about regulating climate change, and it just has to be recognized as a key example of the ills of capitalism, and we have to recognize that to be able to address it effectively. That doesn't mean the world is going to be socialist next week to be able to address climate change, but we have to understand that much of what capitalism represents inevitably caused this crisis that we face now with climate change. And the other piece, I guess, from an individual level, and every bit as important, is for people to be more mindful that every decision they make has an impact on what it means to have a sustainable future. So that runs from transportation choices to food choices to where you live and how you live. And so again, in the US, now that we're in this crisis, people are living in larger houses, driving larger cars, not using public transportation, having a heavy meat-based diet from factory farms. All of these things are catastrophic for sustainability. So individual actions cumulatively can do much more in many ways than government regulation.
Definitely. And we always talk about, energy transition to mitigate the carbon emissions and decarbonize our current world. But it's actually not only about energy transition, but the transition of a whole lifestyle and way of doing business, actually. Actually, you also referred to COVID-19. I was also hoping to learn about your thoughts on that too. It has been definitely worsening things with regards to that, because people now are stuck at their homes. It has been affecting their jobs, the way they are consuming food, goods, the health conditions, of course. It's not maybe the first time that the climate change mitigation efforts, the energy transition, or policies or efforts for sustainable development has been facing a disruptive event, but this is a huge crisis that we are all passing through. What has been the impact of COVID-19 to come up with a sustainable solution, sustainable future for the voiceless from the category of these three groups? What has been the impact of COVID-19?
Well, I like to look for silver linings, and I think one of the things we've learned in a really valuable way about COVID-19 is that it's given us a window into the future about how we can be more sustainable coming out of this pandemic. And certainly the first is, as I referred to, transportation choices are obviously a big impact. When we look at what COVID-19 required of us, it was a requirement of telecommuting and reliance on what we're doing right now, use of the internet to conduct sessions that would have been held in person prior to the pandemic. And so that reduction in travel has had a massive positive impact on our net global greenhouse gas emissions this year. In fact, the scientists are telling us that 2020 globally is going to be the lowest year of greenhouse gas emissions since post-World War II times. And granted, we had to make a lot of intrusive sacrifices very abruptly when the pandemic hit in the spring to be able to do that. But many of the adjustments we made were not only manageable, they were the sort of things we should have been doing prior to the pandemic if we were serious about sustainability. And I think that's also true with our food choices, in the sense that the pandemic caused massive disruptions to the supply chains in the meat and dairy industries, such that there was a more rapid transition to where we need to be going anyway, toward a plant-based food system, or at least a more small-scale, sustainable animal agriculture system. We needed to be away from factory farming years ago, and we're still trapped in it. And I think the COVID-19 pandemic exposed some deficiencies in that system in a very graphic way, where there was massive food waste and an exposure of the conditions, again, of the voiceless, of how factory farm animals are treated. I think that was really positive for protection of the voiceless as well. And then the other is the transition from fossil fuels to renewables. I think that too, what we saw coming out of the pandemic was a massive economic hit to the oil giants, such that without even being required to do so, companies like BP and Sunoco have voluntarily changed their portfolios to include more renewables. And so again, something that was tragic for humanity, the COVID-19 pandemic causing so much death and illness around the globe, I think it's given us this kind of opportunity to say, okay, we need to rethink a lot of the things that we've been doing. Otherwise, we're going to see another pandemic if we don't change these habits. And again, that's our relationship to animals in many ways that makes us vulnerable.
Yeah, Professor, I'm seeing some pop-ups. I think we have questions. So before continuing with my questions, maybe we can check the comments coming from our participants. So I'm seeing Chris. Professor Abate is an inspiration. His work in social equity, climate justice, and clarification on sustainable development is indeed profound, relevant, and needed, he says. I think there is another question here, Nishant. With respect to the short-termism, he asks, may I ask how do you think ESG is changing the scenario practically? How do you feel CSR will be impacting from the pandemic?
Well, there's a lot of acronyms in there that I want to make sure that I and the audience understand. So CSR, I believe, is referring to corporate social responsibility. And the first one in environmental sustainability. ESG, I mean, there are so many acronyms in environmental. I just want to make sure I'm answering the right question. So I guess from what I understand about what the question's asking, I can certainly speak to the CSR if it does mean corporate social responsibility. I think it's very important that perhaps the most rapid mobilization toward renewable energy, toward plant-based food systems would be enhanced responsibility from the corporate sector. So that is something that they are about making a profit. And so I think when businesses see these transitions in our society, that it's not going to be profitable to ultimately engage the way they have been, I think it's very important to accept that responsibility and ultimately not be part of the problem, and ultimately transition in a way that's going to meet society's demands and ultimately enable them to remain profitable by transitioning to renewables, for instance, and still ensure that we've got a sustainable future. That it's not really in their interest, and it's certainly not in society's interest to cling to the bad habits that have put us into this crisis. And then there's other efforts as well about efforts like fossil fuel divestment campaigns. I mean, just trying to build awareness about how we need to be transitioning off of these habits that have really led us to this crisis we face now.
Yeah. Also, there is another question. I think we can have a live guest as well. We have Sabika. She also has a question for you. Maybe if we can just connect her to the session. Yeah. Hello, Sabika. How are you? We can
Hi.
hear you.
Thank you for having me on the show.
Thanks for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Sabika, and I'm calling in from Qatar. And I suppose I'd like to just briefly tap into your expertise in law. And as we all know, that climate change is just not a simple issue. It is not only an environmental issue, it is an issue that is a social issue, an economic issue, a racial one, a gender, ableism, a moral issue. There's just so many layers. But when it comes to law, which is a mechanism to kind of figure this all out, in your opinion, has the field of law evolved enough to allow representation from these vulnerable groups, if you will? And even in the field of law and law schools and whatnot, has environmental law developed enough to be powerful? Do you see enough specialists out there?
Thank you very much for that question, Sabika. I am encouraged by the developments in the US. I can certainly speak to most directly, just in the past decade, that environmental justice as a field has really become much more recognized and respected as a way of seeking to promote change on these issues. And just with the Biden administration, some very progressive thinking people on the notion of environmental justice and how that fits into climate change and sustainability have been appointed. So I have some hope there. But more importantly, what I am most encouraged by is that there were a lot of efforts, creative efforts in the courts with climate change litigation over the past decade. And it wasn't so much about which cases won or lost in the court, but what was encouraging to me about it was that it really transformed climate justice into a movement, into a social movement. And I'm seeing that very much reflected in the youth in American society now, that climate justice is very much a rallying cry, like Black Lives Matter and like Me Too. It's a galvanizing of this demand for social justice and how we move forward. And so environmental justice is a very important piece of those, what used to be different social issues. And now we're seeing those come together in today's youth in the US, and that is also informing who that generation is voting for, who's ultimately getting into state and federal political offices to be able to reflect the will of the public and set agendas on these issues.
Thank you so much. And do I have an opportunity to ask one more question then?
Sure, please do.
Okay, perfect. So, I mean, I understand that capitalism has been the driving force of economies worldwide, and you've also touched upon this in your earlier discussion. But I guess the alarming fact is that it's also the driving force behind the developing economies that are almost myopically kind of going on this narrow path of rapid development. And it tends to kind of emphasize individual prosperity over the more global kind of thinking. So I suppose the question is that, is there a space within capitalism that is being practiced in developing countries to look at actions towards climate change as a win-win situation as opposed to a zero-sum game? Are there any ways to make it, the effects of climate change less conceptually distant? Because at the moment there seems to be very limited pressure to have these sustainable mechanisms in place, especially in these new kind of economies.
That's a great question. So I think that kind of reflects back on this notion of climate in the climate change negotiations, the notion of common but differentiated responsibility in how we need to move forward as a global community to address climate change. And what that really means is that the developed countries have a higher responsibility to lead these transitions away from our bad habits, whether it be capitalism or fossil fuels or factory farming. And essentially, the developing world is entitled to financial and technical assistance from the developed world to help them make that transition in a slower way, because they lack the means, and in fact, they're entitled to their engagement of those capitalism mechanisms to advance their economies, because the developed world had that opportunity and exploited it, and it shouldn't be, well, now there's no room for the developing world to engage in that more short-term capitalistic frame. But the reality is that we're all more informed about what it means to be sustainable. So even with that slower transition in the developing world away from capitalism, there needs to be more sustainable minded thinking in how those capitalistic efforts can move forward. There's no right to exploit the environment. There is a right to develop in a way that's going to sustain the economies of those developing countries without being unduly burdensome on the environment. And so I think that's where there really is this moral and political and economic responsibility in the developed world to support that transition, and that hasn't gone as well as hoped. If there's anything that's come out of the past 3 decades of climate negotiations. It's that the developed world, especially countries like the US, have not embraced that moral responsibility, and the developing world is just pushing back and saying this shouldn't land on our shoulders, and has been very frustrated by that reality.
Thank you, Dr. Randall. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the questions.
Thank you, Sabika, for your questions. I'm reading a couple of more messages that has been going through the screen. So another question is, do you think we need an upgrade for Stockholm and Rio de Janeiro conventions in the 21st century? What changes would you propose, if yes? The question is from Nishan, Professor.
That's an interesting question. I mean, I think there's a lot of value to what Rio and Stockholm embrace. I mean, it was certainly the coming together for the first time globally to have these aspirational instruments about what we ought to be doing to protect the planet. And Stockholm certainly was more, I think, environmentally minded. And Rio was a little bit more about sustainable development and balancing economic and social with environmental, which is also relevant. But I think when we're talking about what's relevant for today, given that even Rio was 92 decades ago, we're in a new place now, and so I think where we are in 2020 is should build on some of those principles, but I think what we really need is a more serious attention to the more ambitious environmental principles of those documents. So two that come to mind to me would be the precautionary principle that we really need to live by in terms of how we address climate change. We were very effective in relying on the precautionary principle to address stratospheric ozone depletion, and we came out of that as victorious. But ultimately, climate change has not followed that track record, and so many reasons, or a core reason why that hasn't occurred, is because the precautionary principle has not been applied to climate change. It's been very much of a cost-benefit way of thinking in how we address climate change. And then another one is intergenerational equity. That's a big focus of my climate change in the Voiceless book. That principle is built into these declarations, and ultimately we aren't living by those principles as readily as we should, as seriously as we should. And I think there's opportunities to build on that. And one example is future generations commissions. These already exist in some countries in Europe, and I think it's going to be hopefully more of the model about how we account for future generations' interests. We have appointed bodies whose job is to consider impacts of legislation or litigation on future generations, and ultimately be a voice for those voiceless entities.
Especially there are several youth delegations and several platforms to include the proposals or policy ideas from the young people and policy entrepreneurship in this regard, or with regards to policies, with regards to tools, with regards to projects, so as to cope with climate change and to offer a sustainable development, is a trending trending topic among the youth as well, and that's quite promising. I think there are also two questions from Chris. So if we can, I would also happy to invite Chris to our live session too. Can we invite Chris?
Oh.
Hello, how are you?
I'm good. This is Chinomsa speaking. Can you all hear me? Yeah.
Yeah,
cool.
We can hear you.
Cool. Thanks, Dr. Randall. I have a question, and it mostly relates to the subject of democracy, the institutions we have at the moment, and how that can stand us in good stead for what we're trying to represent for the Voiceless. So my question is, how do you think our democratic institutions currently are positioned to help us translate the whole communication of climate change for the Voiceless? So do you think we're currently equipped in our democratic institutions to be able to do that, or does something have to be fundamentally changed for us to champion this whole notion of climate change going forward?
Thank you for that question. It's a very complex challenge. So really, this is about information dissemination to the public, and I think one valuable lesson and reference point we have in the U.S. is that many of our federal environmental laws are built on this idea of transparency and accountability in terms of how we ultimately conduct business. That those who hold permits, that who pollute the air and water, ultimately have to disclose publicly whether they are in compliance with their permits. And so I think when it comes to climate change, we don't have that same culture at all, because climate change is so much more complex to regulate. And so when I made the point about sustainable development needs to be a mandate rather than an aspiration, what I mean by that is that we have the ability within our governance systems to say, basically, establish a standard for what it means to be sustainable across a variety of contexts, and then ultimately not allow activity to proceed if it's deemed unsustainable. So an example of that is a court in Australia recently, about a year ago, ultimately issued a decision where there was a proposed coal mine that was going to take Australia out of compliance with its carbon budget, the amount of carbon it could emit and still be in compliance with its climate change commitments. And prior to that decision, there was never a court that ultimately said, well, this project is essentially unsustainable because it takes a country outside its carbon budget. But this judge was very forward thinking and said, this project cannot go forward because it's going to be unsustainable on those terms. And that reference was what it means to be in compliance with your carbon budget as unsustainable. That could be applied in many different contexts about what science and what law and policy tells us is sustainable and what isn't. And so I think that's really where democracy can, with the proper political will, impose those kinds of standards that would ultimately enable us to be sustainable in a way that we haven't been, when sustainable development has really just been window dressing and not really mandatory requirements on what we need to do.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you.
Professor, there are also two more questions from David. The first one is, it has been a half century since Stone's Should Trees Have Standing was published. Has there been much progress in the US or global legal systems on that point? He asks, how does standing relate to your use of voice? He says, and also, what about the role of evolving doctrine on the public trust and trustship notions? How does that relate to your arguments? He asks. So two questions.
Those are two great questions that go very much to the themes of the book. So the first question is one I've spent a lot of time on in my career. I've really worked hard on standing issues, access to the courts in the environmental context, and then later in my career in the animal law context. And it's a huge challenge in the US. We have very restrictive standing requirements about who can bring suits and ultimately be in the court system. Mm-hmm. So what this means in the context of where we are now is that, yes, 50 years have passed since we've seen that very forward-looking scholarship, the Should Trees Have Standing, which was really an effort to say nature itself has intrinsic value and should be able to have rights to be protected in court. Of course, the trees don't talk. A human guardian would be appointed to represent the interests that are recognized by the law. So what we have now, both in environmental law and animal law, which is not nearly as effective, is that in order to protect the trees or in order to protect the endangered species, a human has to have some interest that has been compromised, and then the human can sue on behalf of that harmed resource or animal. And that's not nearly as effective in protecting the voiceless as the voiceless entities having the rights themselves. And so that's progressed a great deal just in the past decade alone in animal rights litigation and in rights of nature developments worldwide. Courts, legislative bodies have recognized this notion of the intrinsic rights that nature and wildlife have. The US has been slower than other countries in this regard. So rivers have been recognized with legal personhood in New Zealand, in Colombia, in India, just to name a few. That didn't go well in the U.S. in a case seeking personhood for the Colorado River. That was rejected. And then on the animal rights side, again, outside the U.S., there have been very significant developments in protecting animals on a variety of legal theories. In the U.S., there's been a leading organization, the Non-Human Rights Project, that has been bringing these cases very doggedly and very effectively, and has made some progress in the courts, but there has not yet been a judgment that says animals have legal personhood. Animals are treated as property under our current system. So really what this means for the proposal is that there is a mechanism called next friend status under US federal rules of civil procedure. And that enables a human to step in on behalf of another person, and person is not defined to only be humans. So a representative can represent the interest of a person who cannot otherwise represent his or her own interests. And so courts have interpreted that so far to be limited to humans, but it says person, and that's where the battle is. Person doesn't have to be limited to humans, and that's where the advocacy of these organizations has been focused. So the other piece about so that's very much about rights-based thinking, and that's a big part of the book proposal. The other part of the book's proposal goes to stewardship, how rights-based thinking is very difficult and challenges people's views about how the law should work, and there are certain challenges about how effectively it can be adopted. So the more intermediate step is, let's just put a higher duty on the government to protect the voiceless. So an effort in the courts, the Juliana case in the US, is that very effort. It's looking to expand the notion of the public trust doctrine to say that not just the wet sands on the coast and the riverbeds and freshwater bodies, but let's say the government has a duty to protect the integrity of the atmosphere on behalf of the people. And that's a very ambitious expansion of what public trust means, but it's an appropriate one, because arguably the government ought to have that responsibility if it really is about protecting the public health, safety, and welfare of the population. What's more fundamental than the integrity of the atmosphere? I mean, that's really where our ultimate future lies, to ensure that we're fighting climate change effectively. So I think the idea of public trust has been quite powerfully and creatively used, not just in that Juliana case, but in many other contexts now, to enhance the protection of wildlife and in other ways. That these are ways where lawyers are doing really inspiring things to get protection for voiceless in ways that traditional existing law does not.
Professor, I know that you are more focused on the US, and you handle the issue more from the United States perspective, in line with your expertise, but I'm asking this out of curiosity, actually. All these challenges are universal, they are valid for all the countries, and all the countries must act on this so that we can have plausible solutions and sustainable solutions, of course. But the way the national countries deal with these problems are quite divergent. Even how they define the problem is very different across cases. Do you see any specific patterns across the regions, or some specific significant national characteristics across different countries with regards to dealing with the voiceless, with the nature, with animal laws? Is there maybe some cultural traits or some regime types which are more inclined to value the animal law or environmental law more? Do you have such remarks?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So the trends that I see are in Latin America. There are many very progressive constitutional provisions that are meant to protect the voiceless. So there's an enhanced effort, at least aspirationally, in constitutions like in Ecuador and Bolivia, and Colombia certainly has protections in this regard that are really much more ambitious than you see in countries like the U.S. or Canada and Australia. The challenge that they face is enforcing those ambitious protections, because they're just words on a page in their constitutions, and if they don't have legislation to implement those aspirations, and if they don't have a very effective court system to enforce them, it's just words on the page. So they're doing that better than the U.S., and some of their courts are actually yielding very effective results, but we're still waiting to see how effectively those results are enforced now. So, for instance, in Colombia, the Atrato River was granted legal personhood, and now we have to see how effectively that opportunity for enhanced protection is going to be enforced. So another trend that I see is that the use of the courts, U.S. has a very sophisticated court system, really uses the courts in ways that other countries don't, in that we have a challenge with our legislature. Congress hasn't done anything productive for the environment in decades in the U.S. So when you have the legislative body not fulfilling its role, the courts are then consulted to say, let's try to get the courts to make some law that the legislature hasn't. And in that instance, you get some good outcomes, but they're very one at a time kind of outcomes. They aren't uniform. They often conflict. So it's better than nothing, but it's not the right way to go about doing it in the long term. Whereas in other countries that aren't on a common law system, so that similar reality that we see in the U.S., we're also seeing in systems like India. They have a common law system. They're doing a lot through their courts. But in other countries, it is very much about legislative efforts. And another trend I'm seeing is that it's much harder to get effective legislative efforts on these issues at the federal level in countries. There are much more effective things happening closer to the people. So at a state or provincial level, and even in the US at the local level, some very ambitious protections are happening. So it's important to remember that ideally we want to see as many things happening at the federal level, but things that happen at the subnational level are very, very important and need to be pursued. And one example of that is California. California has outstanding provisions on these issues. If California were a country, it's the 5th largest economy in the world. So just because it's only one of our states doesn't mean that we're not doing anything. We need to do much more in the US, but to the extent that California and the impact it has on the global economy and environment is doing a lot of very good things is really very, very important.
So we can say that basically two major takeaways. One, there's still a gap between the action and words. Even though some countries might have legislation or words on paper, as you just said, it's not yet fully being transferred into the action. And second, there's a need to bridge the local efforts with the national and even international efforts so that they become effective policy options or legal options. I think there's a new comment, talking about global legal systems. The watershed of sustainability and intellectual property rights has been gaining momentum. What are your views on the future scope of this development? Nishant asks.
I don't have as much experience on this issue. I mean, certainly the idea of intellectual property rights as clashing with sustainability values certainly has a lot of manifestations, and that's been going on a while. I think that what we need is more effective global governance on that notion, and there are some efforts that do address that. The biosafety protocol is one of them under the Convention on Biological Diversity that speaks to that to some degree. The problem that we always run into, though, is that the actors that potentially cause the most harm are the ones that aren't parties to these treaties. So again, the U.S. is a frequent violator of that proposition. And for instance, when you've got treaties that protect the rights of indigenous peoples, really great language in some of these efforts, and they have about 20 parties, and not surprisingly, most of the countries who are parties to these treaties are in Latin America. Well, that's not going to protect the indigenous peoples very well when the exploiters are coming from the West and from China, and ultimately not paying attention, not bound by those treaties that are designed to protect the vulnerable there. So it's a huge challenge on international governance when you don't have the developed countries accepting the responsibility, their political, their moral responsibility for leadership. And again, I'm mildly hopeful that will change slightly under the Biden administration, but it's not going to be night and day change by any means. The U.S. has failed in its leadership on these issues for 3 decades now.
Yeah, as you said, the change will not be from today to tomorrow, of course, but we are always hoping for the best. To leave with a positive note, maybe, a last question. I know that there are many students, many sustainability volunteers who are watching us today. Do you have any messages to them as a professor working on these topics for so many years, and as a expert on these issues? What would be your advice for them with regards to their studies and actions with regards to sustainability?
Well, it's always inspiring to be able to leave a hopeful note on these issues, because it is very overwhelming and depressing in many ways. But I'm, as one who's now teaching at the college level, teaching law courses to college students rather than law students, graduate students, I've enjoyed that opportunity to really help inform the upcoming generation of opportunities about how they can make a difference before they're already trapped in a profession and feeling kind of overwhelmed. So I think with sustainability, this used to be very much about purchase a hybrid vehicle or make sure you're recycling, and then the discussion stops. I think the most important thing about sustainability advocates is that it's important for them to embrace and to convey the reality to their constituents that sustainability is so broad-based and multifaceted. So when I'm an advisor to the Sustainability Club at my university, and again, if left to their own devices, they might plant a community garden and make sure we have effective recycling on campus and think that they've done their job. And I understand that that's valuable, but there's so many more ways they can be engaged. So now they're starting to see that engaging with the dining services about food waste is massive. I mean, just food waste alone. If food waste were a country, it would be the #3 greenhouse gas emitter on the planet. That's how bad food waste is as a sustainability challenge. So if you just immerse in one of these many daunting sustainability challenges and get beyond, recycling, it's going to help a lot. And it is about every individual choice we make. And that's where fossil fuel divestment campaigns have been very powerful. It's just making sure that everyone is more aware about the impacts that every one of our decisions we make on a daily basis has on global sustainability, and spreading that message in as many ways as you can. So I think this generation is also much more empowered to get formal education on these things in a way that I never had. So I encourage them to pursue specialized programs in sustainability and climate and energy. There's all kinds of new job opportunities in the U.S. Climate and energy law is considered the 3rd fastest growing sector for legal jobs right now. So it's not just pursuing a niche interest, it's about economic security too. This is where the work is going to be if we have a chance for a sustainable future.
And not only for based on individuals as well, for countries as well, diversification of the economy, especially for the countries which are based on fossil fuels. They need to diversify their economies away from fossil fuels so that they can survive in the hopefully new world, which will be decarbonized and which will be more sustainable for the voiceless as well. Professor, there are tons of questions and topics that I would love to continue talking about with you, but we are reaching the end of our time. Thank you so much for your remarks, for your valuable insights. I'm sure the audience and me as well, we enjoyed a lot your comments and remarks. Thank you so much for joining us. And I would also like to thank Green Institute for giving us this opportunity to host this Green Room session. And of course, I would love to thank to you, our dear participants, for your questions and remarks. Thank you so much, Professor.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you, and we would love to see you in another Green episode, Green Room episode. Take care. Bye-bye.